Welcome. What I'd like to discuss today is the relationship between the external environment and organizations, and how changes in their context will signal changes in the organization's work and structure. This relationship is described using systems theory or systems thinking. Systems thinking is also used to understand how internal forces may also influence how work is done and how structures may be modified. Systems theory was originally used by biologists to help explain the relationship between living organisms and their external environment. It was later applied to the fields of cybernetics, organizational, and social systems to describe relationships and categorize events to help understand the connections between organizations and the larger society, as well as between the organization and people who inhabit them. Systems thinking helps administrators identify and categorize events, establish relationships among events, and enables them to identify opportunities for key individuals, groups, or agencies to participate in making appropriate decisions. Systems thinking is essential for educational leaders as it facilitates understanding their work as being continual, complex, relational, and adaptive rather than as a set of simplistic, routine managerial activities. In this regard, systems thinking focuses on understanding the relationship between organizations and their external environment. But it's not a theory in the orthodox sense that it does not try to explain relationships, but rather focuses on describing and categorizing events. Ludwig von Bertalanffy developed the general systems theory that viewed biological organisms and organizations as living things which are interdependent with the environmental ecosystem in which they exist. When applied to human systems, any change in the international, national, or local environment will alter conditions and force organizations to adapt by changing its structure or work, or face the possibility of becoming irrelevant. General systems theory also alerts us to the interrelatedness of systems and the concept of subsystems and multiple causality. Systemic thinking is useful in that it helps develop the ability to see things as a whole rather than in its parts, to see connections among issues, events, and information. Industrial-era thinking is linear and offers simple answers to complex problems, simple cause and effect. Systems thinking, however, stresses understanding complex interrelationships, the interdependency that influence events, and is referred to as multiple causality. For example, understanding complex factors associated with the rise of a global economy helps us understand why we need to change learning and teaching and improve student outcomes. We are well aware of the fact that the external environment influences the structure of organizations. In this regard, the boundary between the organization and the environment is viewed as being permeable. In other words, what happens outside, in terms of international, national, state, and local environments, may force organizations to change their internal structures as well as the nature of their work in order to adapt and survive. We also know that organizations vary in degree to which they are influenced by external environment. For example, public schools are more stable over time as they enjoy special status in society and have continuous funding. That is not the case with private sector organizations. In general, the greater the environmental turbulence or uncertainty, the greater the need for flexibility to change organizational structures and the way work is conducted. Unfortunately, popular wisdom of educational reform has been to tighten up, including accountability and re-centralization, rather than rethink how we educate children, including how we restructure schools to enhance learning. Organizations, like organisms, seek equilibrium with their external environments. They are dependent on the external environment for survival. Organisms and organizations must adapt to changes in their respective environments or face extinction. For example, changes in water level and temperature in a tidal pool triggers adaptive behavior of creatures who live in it. If they don't, they die. Here's another example. Changes in the global economy require changes in education to ensure workers have 21st century skills and the nation survives economically. If schools can't change, society will replace them with a system that produces the desired results. I have prepared several definitions of terms that are frequently used in systems theory. The external environment includes international, changes in the global economy and politics; national, changes in the national economy, politics, Supreme Court decisions, federal government policies, and technology; state level, tax revenues, legislation, and court decisions; and the local level, again, tax revenues, school board elections, demographic changes, and interest group pressures. Inputs include both demands and supports. Demands and stresses refer to disturbances in the external environment that create stress that requires the organization to respond. Supports, on the other hand, refer to the willingness of the community to provide resources, accept school processes, and programs. The term process, or throughputs, refers to deliberations that determine how to respond to demands, stresses, and find acceptable corrective action or outputs. The term with inputs refers to internal experts and institutional values that are part of the process of deliberation. And there are two types of feedback, including formative and summative. Formative feedback refers to ongoing refinement of program or policy implementation. Summative feedback, on the other hand, refers to evaluations of program or policies after a determined period of time based on explicit pre-implementation expectations. The next slide depicts von Bertalanffy's general systems model. It illustrates how systems theory categorizes external events and internal processes that may be used to help an organization adapt to environmental changes. This is how systems model works. First, you identify an input that signals a demand on the organization for change. Second, you gather information and people, including experts on the problem, to engage in a process of deliberation that produces a solution or an output. The output is tailored to solve the problem. Before it is implemented, you determine how you're going to measure success. Then you collect feedback. As discussed, there are two types of feedback. Formative is ongoing near-term correction, and summative, which is at the end of the project, assessment. Feedback is used as an input to report on whether the problem was solved, the solution needed to be modified, or replaced. There are several other terms that are used in systems theory. The first is simple causality. Simple cause and effect depict linear relationships which may be naive. Many people like to say, "Keep it simple, stupid, KISS." But when trying to understand the relationship between an organization and its environment, KISS may be both simple and stupid. Syatt and March note that in complex organizations, cause may be far removed from effect, solutions remote from problems, and feedback delayed or misleading. It's a lot like flipping a light switch and nothing happens. But understanding relationships that influence an organization may alert you to threats to survival as well as opportunities to adapt and prosper. It's interesting to note that the Chinese character for danger and opportunity are the same. The next slide depicts industrial era linear thinking. The second term is multiple causality. As we have learned, systems thinking focuses on the relationship between the organization and its external environment, that may influence its structure, work, and survival. Thus, leaders are well advised to continuously scan the environment to examine multiple factors that may require the organization to adapt. This practice may enable you to anticipate changes, gain time needed to adapt, and avoid crises. This figure illustrates the relationship between the external environment and the organization, as well as internal dynamics that may also influence how work is done and the structure of the organization changed. This slide illustrates several aspects of the external environment, including economic, political, and demographic changes that may alter the nature of work and how the organization is structured. In addition, it recognizes that internal social systems may have similar effects on work and structure. Several other terms are frequently used to provide insight into the strengths and weaknesses of centralization and decentralization, including tightly and loosely coupled systems. Most people think about school systems only in terms of their bureaucracies, with hierarchically organized top-down administrative structures that control activities. Researchers, however, have long recognized that school systems and schools may be characterized as being both tightly coupled bureaucratic hierarchies in some respects and loosely coupled in other respects. We can see these in terms of the distribution of schools in a school district, as well as how instructional activities are carried out within a school. Tight and loose coupling offers advantages and disadvantages that we will briefly discuss. Administrators should be aware of both dimensions and be adept at using directive approaches, appropriate to tightly coupled situations, and more persuasive collegial style, appropriate to loosely coupled instructional side of the organization. Tight coupling refers to the bureaucratic aspect of school organizations that exercises top-down control described by scientific management, hierarchical, and bureaucratic theories. District-level bureaucracies efficiently handle routine, non-instructional work such as paying teachers, purchasing supplies, scheduling instruction, accounting for students, conducting examinations, and making system-wide changes through policies and procedures. But they tend to be rigid and rule-bound and inhibits individual schools in adapting and delivering programs that meet the unique learning needs of students and neighborhoods. In other words, tightly coupled systems reflect the one-size-fits-all mentality. At the building level, school principals use the school's bureaucracy, including rules, regulations, and policy, to indirectly influence the behavior of teachers and the instructional program through scheduling, teacher assignments, student grouping, and the control of resources. Now let's look at the characteristics of loosely coupled systems. The nature of work in schools is difficult to explain using classical or bureaucratic theory. The concept of loose coupling, developed by Carl Weick, suggests that although the school bureaucracy and classroom instructional activities are related, the linkages between the two are weak. Given the nature of work in schools, students, and instructional methods, loose coupling is a functional and necessary arrangement. In this regard, principals and classroom teachers are only under the general supervisory control of principals and have considerable autonomy in carrying out their administrative and instructional activities. In addition, the idea of loose coupling allows a school to be more responsive to students or local needs. A school can adapt more quickly to changes and demands placed on it and requires that the principal use a more consultative or participatory style to accomplish work. The notion of loose coupling suggests that schools are subsystems and validate school district decentralization initiatives. Loose coupling, however, makes it difficult to detect problems at the school or classroom levels until they become serious. In addition, loose coupling makes it difficult to quickly implement school or system-wide changes. At this point, I would like to introduce the work of Argyris and Schoen, who made a major contribution to understanding organizational learning and change processes that use systems thinking model. Organizational learning is viewed as an inquiry process that begins with detecting an error or a mismatch between what you intend to happen and what actually occurs, or an input that is followed by a decision process, then corrective action, output, and evaluation, feedback. In this regard, organizational learning is a systematic inquiry process. Argyris and Shern describe two types of change. Type 1 changes tend to be superficial and are based on existing assumptions and fixing immediate problems. When problems persist, you need to move to Type 2 change that involves revising basic assumptions and implementing new strategies to correct the error. When problems are solved, new organizational assumptions are adopted by organizational members. They also describe two levels of organizational learning: single loop and double loop learning. Single loop learning is a Type 1 change because it describes attempts to fix problems using existing assumptions and norms. It's focused on tinkering with organizational practices to improve effectiveness in achieving existing organizational goals and objectives. Double loop learning, on the other hand, is a Type 2 change, which is more difficult to achieve. It can be accomplished when members examine the contradiction between expectations, or what we want to happen, and what actually occurs. This requires challenging the norms and assumptions of the organization. It is a cyclical inquiry process composed of asking questions, collecting and analyzing data, reflecting on findings, taking action, and evaluating the outcomes which are subsequently used as new data. If problems are corrected, basic assumptions are changed, and norms and values and beliefs of the organizations are also changed. The next slide shows how the general systems model was used to describe organizational learning and levels of change. System thinking was also used to depict the dynamic relationship between the organization and the individual discussed previously as internal dynamics or social systems. Getzels and Guba discuss the relational nature of social systems in organizations as having two broad dimensions that are independent yet interactive and influence the behavior of organizational members. The first is the institutional or nomothetic dimension, which presents the organization's ascribed roles and expectations that are embedded in formal structures and cultures. The second is the individual or idiographic dimension that encompasses idiosyncratic personality and need dispositions that motivate individuals. Thus, social behavior of individuals and organizations results from an interplay between institutional expectations and individual need dispositions. As discussed previously, the balance between institutional and individual needs is accomplished within the work group. The next slide depicts the interaction between the organization and the individual that results in observed behavior. In sum, Getzels and Guba's work support the notion that behavior is a function of personality times environment. At this point, I would like you to review several key concepts. Using general systems theory, discuss the notion that changes in the external environment may influence changes in an organization's work and structure. Next, let's apply what you've learned. How would you use systems thinking to assess emerging changes in the environment that may influence your own organization? Finally, let's look at some macro shifts taking place in our external environment and engage in problem solving. First, I would like you to review these YouTube videos. Then answer this question: how will these environmental shifts influence your organization and our collective future? I hope this brief review will prove helpful to you in thinking about systems theory.